All right, let's dive into this Quadrant Future Tek Ltd.
Quadrant Future Tek.
Yeah, they're an Indian company, and looks like they're getting ready for their IPO.
Okay.
You've given us, well, quite a bit to go
Yeah.
through, their red herring prospectus, financial reports, all sorts of things.
That's good.
So I guess the goal here is to equip our listeners with enough knowledge to kind of size up Quadrant Future Tek,
Absolutely.
see what their potential is, see if it makes sense
Okay.
for them.
Yeah.
So to start off, maybe just a quick overview.
Sure.
What exactly does Quadrant Future Tek do?
Well, they're involved in two pretty key sectors,
Okay.
specialty cables and train control systems.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So think high-tech, very important infrastructure.
Yeah.
The kind that's really essential for a country like India that's growing so fast.
Right.
And what's really interesting is that they're not just making any old cables. We're
Okay.
talking heavy-duty stuff, the kind used by Indian railways.
Wow.
Even naval defense. They're also developing India's own automatic train protection system called KAVAK.
Kava.
Yeah, it's a big deal because it's all about making rail travel safer
Right.
and more efficient.
Interesting.
So they have this unique blend of manufacturing power and cutting-edge tech.
I see.
And their business is very closely tied to India's goals of modernizing their railways, boosting their defense, and embracing renewable energy.
Huge growth areas.
Absolutely huge growth area.
So going back to the beginning, how long has Quadrant Future Tek been around?
Well, they were founded back in 2015.
Okay.
Initially, they were focused on specialty cables.
Right.
They've actually got over 6 years of experience producing those specialized cables.
And these cables are for what kind of environments?
They're really good at making cables for high radiation environments.
Wow.
So
Got
that's their foundation. But they jumped into train control systems in 2021.
it. Okay.
That's when they aligned themselves with this big KAVAK project from Indian Railways.
Right.
The goal is to create a homegrown automatic train protection system.
So almost like an autopilot for trains.
Exactly, to reduce accidents caused by human error.
Right, of course.
Or equipment failure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it was a smart move because Indian Railways is huge.
Yeah.
And it's always expanding.
With so many people and goods they move around, safety is super important.
Absolutely, it's paramount.
Now, something that stands out to me is that Quadrant Future Tek uses this very advanced tech
Right.
electron beam processing
Yeah.
for both their cables and train control systems.
It's not very common in India.
Okay.
And it lets them make these super strong, high-quality cables
Uh-huh.
that can handle really tough conditions.
Interesting.
But the cool thing is, the tech has other uses, too.
Like what?
Sterilizing medical devices, even processing gems.
Wow, that's versatile.
It is. It's versatile and fast, which gives them an edge in terms of production.
Okay, so we've got a company that's in two vital industries using some really advanced technology.
Yeah.
But what about the bigger picture? What's the growth potential like for these industries in India?
Well, let's look at the numbers.
Okay.
The Indian specialty cables market is expected to grow at a CAGR of 9.8%.
Okay.
Through 2030, reaching a value of almost 600 million US dollars.
So essentially it's doubling in size every decade.
Pretty much, yeah.
Wow.
And what's driving this growth? It's a few things.
Okay.
India's really pushing for renewable energy infrastructure, which needs specialized cables.
Makes sense.
Their railway network is expanding like crazy, and there's tons of investment in metro rail projects in major cities.
So Quadrant Future Tek's cables are kind of like essential building blocks for India's growth.
In a way, yes.
And what about the train control system side of things?
Well, there are two main parts to that.
Okay.
Automatic train protection, like KAVAKs,
Right.
which is projected to grow by a huge 14% per year through 2030.
Wow, that's a lot.
And then there are dispatch centralized systems,
Okay.
which are also seeing steady growth, around 9%.
So Quadrant Future Tek is in both of these segments.
Exactly. They're really well positioned to benefit from these rapidly expanding markets.
Like they've got a front row seat to India's infrastructure boom.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so we know these industries are growing fast.
Right.
But how does Quadrant Future Tek actually make money? Where's their revenue coming from?
Their main source of revenue right now is selling those specialty cables,
Okay.
mostly to Indian Railways and the naval defense industry.
So a lot of their business is tied to government contracts.
Right.
Now, the revenue from their train control systems division, is that starting to pick up?
It's starting to, yeah.
Okay.
Mostly from supplying the KAVA system to Indian railways.
But there's room for growth there.
Oh, absolutely. Tons of potential.
But these are really popular markets.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're not the only ones playing in this space.
Of course not.
What gives them an advantage over the competition?
That's a good question because competition is tough.
Yeah.
But Quadrant Future Tek has a few things going for them. First, their manufacturing facility is really top-notch.
We talked about that electron beam accelerator.
Oh, yeah.
The one they also use for diamonds.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
It is.
Does that give them a leg up?
Yeah. It helps them produce high-quality cables really fast.
Okay.
So they could potentially outproduce their rivals.
Interesting.
But beyond the equipment, they have a strong research and development team.
I see.
They're always innovating, especially in railway signaling and embedded systems design.
So they're not just making products, they're developing their own solutions.
Exactly.
Which is a big deal in India right now.
It's like the Made in India movement, but for high-tech train safety.
I like that.
And they've got the credentials to back it up.
Oh, yeah.
They've got approvals from the Research Designs and Standards Organization, which sets the standards for Indian railways.
Okay.
The Directorate of Quality Assurance for the Navy, and the Indian Register of Shipping.
That's quite a trifecta.
It is. It gives them serious credibility.
So they've got the tech, the approvals, the government contracts. But what about their financials? How's their performance been?
Well, their statements show big growth in revenue over the last 3 years.
So they're on the up and up.
They are, but whether that's sustainable is another question.
What factors could throw them off course?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Literally, yeah.
A few things to think about.
Okay.
Their EBITDA and PAT margins have been up and down a bit, although they did improve in 2024.
Right.
In the 6 months ending September 30th, 2024, their revenue was about $651 million.
Okay.
Most of that came from railway cable sales.
Okay.
Their EBITDA margin for that period was a slim 1.25%.
Slim? Yeah.
And their PAT margin was actually negative.
Not great.
No, not ideal.
So they're still heavily reliant on that one sector.
Even with the train control system starting to bring in some money.
And those margins, especially the negative PAT margin,
Yeah.
that's something investors will want to look at closely.
For sure.
It's kind of like judging a marathon runner based on the first mile, right?
It is. We need to look at the long game.
Anything else jump out at you from their financials?
One good sign is that their debt-to-equity ratio has been going down.
So they're becoming less reliant on debt financing.
Exactly.
That's a good sign.
It is a good indicator of their financial health.
What about their cash flow?
Their cash flow from operations has been positive in recent years.
So another positive.
Yeah.
All right, so the financials are a mixed bag, but there are some promising signs.
That's fair to say.
But let's talk about the IPO.
Okay.
What are the key details you found in the prospectus?
Well, Quadrant Future Tek is trying to raise up to $2,900 million.
Okay.
They're offering up to 2 equity shares at a price of euros per share.
Right.
But those numbers could still change.
So there's some wiggle room there.
Exactly.
What are they planning to do with all that cash?
They have 3 main objectives.
Right.
First, they need to fund working capital for their specialty cables division.
That's their bread and butter.
Right.
Okay, what else?
Second, they want to pay off part of a loan they took out for developing their train collision avoidance system.
So kind of cleaning up some debt.
Yeah.
And lastly,
A chunk of the funds will be for general corporate purposes.
that always vague category.
Right.
Transparency is key, especially with an IPO.
Absolutely.
Investors want to know where their money is going.
Of course.
But aside from paying off debts and general expenses, what about growth?
They're planning to use the money to actually expand the business.
Okay.
They've got a multifaceted growth strategy.
Lay it on us.
They're really doubling down on their train control and signaling division.
Okay.
They plan to make their product development team much bigger.
Shows they're serious.
They are. It's a clear signal that they see R&D as key in this market.
It's like they're placing a big bet on the future of railway safety in India.
That's one way to put it.
Given the growth projections we talked about, it seems like a smart bet.
It does.
They're also looking to expand into new areas of automatic train protection and railway safety,
Not just sticking with Kavak.
branching out.
Exactly.
What about their specialty cables business?
They're not just going to coast.
Okay.
They're planning to grow that business too, moving into sectors beyond railways and defense.
Like what?
Renewable energy, electric vehicles.
All those sectors need good, reliable cables.
Absolutely.
So they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Nope.
But they're clearly betting on India's overall infrastructure growth.
They are.
And their alignment with the Make in India initiative is a good sign.
It shows their commitment to domestic manufacturing and tech advancement.
Which is good for investors and the government.
Sure.
Okay, all of this sounds promising.
Yeah.
But to really get a sense of their potential, we need some context.
Yeah.
How do they stack up against other tech companies?
Right.
What's their market share like?
That's where things get a bit tricky.
How so?
The sources you gave us didn't have specific market share data, but we can get some clues by looking at their clients.
Okay.
They work with major players like the Ministry of Railways
Right.
and various defense organizations.
So they're not just some small operation.
Not at all.
And the size of the projects they're involved in, like Quadrant,
Yeah,
speaks volumes.
it does. That's a massive undertaking.
So they're a force to be reckoned with.
They are.
But even with all this impressive tech and their focus on these groaning industries,
Uh-huh.
every investment has risks.
Of course.
What should potential investors be wary of when it comes to Quadrant Future Tek?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
One of the biggest risks, and this is common for companies that rely heavily on government contracts,
Okay.
is concentration risk.
You mean because so much of their revenue comes from Indian Railways?
Exactly.
Right.
If the government changes its priorities, spending, or even just who gets the contracts.
Their business could take a hit.
Exactly.
So a lack of diversification of their customer base is a potential red flag.
It is.
What else?
Competition, of course.
Right, we touched on that.
It's worth emphasizing they face competition from Indian and international companies.
In both of their markets.
Right, both specialty cables and train control systems.
Okay, so they need to stay ahead of the game.
They do.
And speaking of staying ahead, the tech world is always evolving.
That's true.
What about the risk of their technology becoming outdated?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Technology risk is a big deal in this sector.
Keeping up with the changes requires a lot of investment.
It does, in research and development, upgrades, all of that.
So investors need to ask themselves, is Quadrant Future Tek agile enough to adapt?
Exactly.
And then there's the regulatory risk.
Right.
Changes in safety and environmental regulations, especially in railways and defense, could impact their operations.
Absolutely.
All right. We've covered a lot here.
We have.
Their history, their industries, their business model, even their financials.
We've highlighted their strengths.
And uncovered some potential
I
risks.
think we've learned quite a bit.
We have, but there's always more to learn.
That's true.
What parts of Quadrant Future Tek stood out to you? What questions are you thinking about?
I'm really interested in their financial performance.
Okay.
Those margins are a bit worrying,
Yeah.
and I'd like to dig deeper into their debt situation.
Great question.
Yeah.
We'll be tackling that and more of your curated source material in part 2 of this deep dive.
Looking forward to.
Stay tuned because things are about to get even more interesting.
I'm sure they will.
Welcome back.
To the deep dive.
Picking up our Quadrant Future Tek investigation.
Right.
Like a good detective story.
Yeah,
We're uncovering some interesting clues.
definitely.
You know, when we first started looking at this,
Uh-huh.
I wasn't sure what to think.
Okay.
Specialty cables,
Yeah,
train control systems,
right.
didn't exactly sound like a thrilling investment.
I see.
But the more we dig, the more potential I see.
Yeah, it's all about connecting the dots.
Exactly.
Quadrant Future Tek isn't just about cables and trains. It's about India's ambition.
To become a global power,
Exactly.
they're riding this huge infrastructure boom.
And that's what makes this IPO so interesting.
It is. Let's get back to those financials because
Okay.
that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
We touched on their revenue growth,
Yeah,
but I think we need to break down those profit margins a bit more.
makes sense.
That EBITDA margin of 1.25% for the 6 months ending September 30, 2024
Mm-hmm.
seems pretty thin, doesn't it?
It does seem a bit low,
Yeah.
but keep in mind that figure includes other income.
Right.
If you take that out.
Yeah.
Their operating EBITDA margin was a little higher at 1.26%.
Okay, so a small improvement.
Still not amazing, but it gives a slightly better picture of their profitability
Right.
from their core business operations.
Still not setting the world on fire, though.
Not yet. Oh,
And then there's that negative PAT margin.
yeah,
For that same period,
right.
a whopping negative 18.5%.
Definitely something investors will be looking at.
For sure. Not exactly what they want to see.
No, it is a bit concerning, but you have to remember the context.
Okay.
The train control and signaling division.
Yeah.
They're a big bet for the future.
Right.
It's just starting to generate revenue,
It's operating at a loss right now.
which is dragging down their overall profitability.
So it's like a startup inside a bigger company.
Yeah, kinda.
Those early losses are almost expected.
In a way, yes.
It's the long-term potential investors need to focus on.
Exactly.
But speaking of potential red flags, you mentioned wanting to look closer at their debt.
Right.
The prospectus shows they had an outstanding cash credit of $230 million
Okay.
at an interest rate of 9.85%.
As of October 31st, 2024.
Right.
Plus a working capital term loan.
With an outstanding balance of
$4.41 million.
at 8.67%,
Those interest rates aren't tiny.
especially given their profitability.
Yeah, it raises an important question.
Is it manageable?
Exactly. Can they handle those debts while still investing in growth?
With those thin margins?
It's something investors will want to look into.
Absolutely. And speaking of debt,
Yeah.
one of their stated objectives for the IPO is to pay off some of the loan.
The one they took out for their train collision avoidance system.
Right.
They're planning to use euro 236.19 million of the IPO proceeds for that.
Okay, so that addresses one of the debts.
Yeah.
But they're also putting a significant amount.
Right.
The exact figure isn't clear yet.
Towards general corporate purposes.
Right.
Which always makes me a bit nervous.
It does feel a bit like a black box.
It does, yeah.
Transparency is so important.
Especially for a company going public.
Investors want to know where their money's going.
Absolutely. It's not unusual for companies to keep some funds for unexpected costs or opportunities.
Right.
But too much vagueness can be a worry.
For sure. Investors want to be sure the money's being used well.
Not just for executive salaries or hiding losses.
Exactly. Speaking of their growth strategy, I think we should emphasize how important Quadrant Future Tek's R&D is.
It's the heart of their future plans.
Especially in that train control and signaling division.
They're putting their money where their mouth is.
Expanding their railway signaling and embedded system design center.
They're planning to add a lot more people to the team.
Engineers, product managers, consultants.
Shows they're serious about innovation.
It's a smart move.
News.
They're not just relying on what they already have.
They're pushing the boundaries.
And it aligns perfectly with the Make in India initiative.
It's a win-win.
Attracting inventors and government support.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears a bit and look at how they're positioning themselves in these industries.
Okay.
Starting with specialty cables.
They're one of the few manufacturers in India with approvals from RDSO, DQAN, and the Indian Register of Shipping.
Those are impressive credentials.
They are.
No wonder they've got contracts with the Ministry of Railways and defense organizations.
Those aren't easy clients to get.
It says a lot about their products.
It does.
And remember that 2.5 MeV electron beam industrial accelerator we talked about?
That's not just a fancy toy.
It gives them a real advantage.
It does. They can meet the demands of these industries.
And potentially beat their rivals on price and delivery.
Right.
So they've got a good foothold in the specialty cables market.
But what about train control systems?
That's the newer, maybe riskier side of their business.
It is, but it's also where their growth potential is huge.
The Indian Railways is modernizing.
And Quadrant Future Tek wants to be a major part of that.
Their flagship product, Kavach, is a great example of how they're using tech to improve safety and efficiency.
It's a fascinating system.
For those of us who aren't engineers,
Yeah.
can you explain how Kavach works?
Sure, the prospectus gets technical.
Yeah.
But it's important for investors to understand it.
Absolutely.
Imagine a network of RFID tags along the tracks.
Okay.
These tags send information to the Kavach system on the train.
Which is basically a computer in the locomotive.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the train knows where it is.
Right.
It gets info about signals, speed limits.
Even the location of other trains.
Right.
Wow.
If there's danger, like another train on the same track,
Oh.
KVH automatically hits the brakes.
Preventing a collision.
That's the idea.
So it's a safety net for human error.
Kind of like a guardian angel for the railways.
I like that.
It's designed to override mistakes.
Malfunctions in the signaling system.
Exactly.
It's a sophisticated system.
And it's always evolving.
And KVH is just the beginning, right?
Right. They're also working on electronic interlocking systems.
What are those?
They control train movement through complex track layouts.
Like in stations.
Yeah.
Making sure the right train goes on the right track at the right time.
Exactly. Crucial with all the rail traffic in India.
It's all about safety and efficiency.
These interlocking systems are getting more and more advanced.
Digital displays, computerized controls.
It's another example of how Quadrant Future Tek is modernizing India's railways.
They're positioning themselves as leaders.
They are, but with all this focus on government contracts and domestic manufacturing.
Yeah. Do they have any global aspirations?
That's a great question.
Are they happy to just be a big fish in India?
Or are they looking at international markets?
Something investors should definitely consider. Their current focus is on India.
Right.
Their prospectus hints at plans to expand their cables business internationally.
Interesting.
They talk about exploring new sectors beyond railways and defense.
Which could mean going overseas.
It makes sense. The global demand for high-quality specialty cables is huge.
Especially for things like renewable energy projects.
And large-scale infrastructure.
Right, so while they're focused on India's growth,
It wouldn't be surprising to see them start looking globally soon.
it sounds like a classic story of ambition.
A company with a solid base, aiming high.
It's exciting, but ambition can be risky.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
The final part of our Quadrant Future Tek investigation.
We're putting the pieces together.
Like a puzzle.
Seeing the bigger picture.
Right.
We've talked about their strengths, their ambitions.
Yeah.
But let's not forget the risks.
Of course.
One thing that's been bugging me is their reliance on the Indian government.
Okay.
Those big contracts with Indian Railways, the Ministry of Defense.
Right.
Just how much do they depend on this one client?
Well, the prospectus shows that a big chunk of their revenue came from the railways.
How big?
91% in the first half of fiscal 2025.
Wow, that's a lot riding on one customer.
It's definitely a concentration risk.
Any change in government policy, spending,
Even just who gets the contracts.
could really hurt their bottom line.
It's like putting all your eggs in one basket.
And it's not just railways.
Their defense contracts also contribute to this reliance on the government,
Makes them vulnerable.
to things beyond their control.
Investors need to be aware of that.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about their suppliers for a minute.
Okay.
Any red flags there?
One interesting thing is that they get a lot of their raw materials from overseas.
Oh.
Copper, rubber, those kinds of things.
Imported from,
Various countries.
okay.
USA, Italy, China. So they're not totally made in India.
Despite aligning themselves with that initiative,
Makes them susceptible to global issues.
supply chain problems, currency fluctuations, geopolitical stuff,
All of that could disrupt production,
increase costs.
impact their profitability.
It's another risk for investors to think about.
So we've talked about customers, suppliers.
Right.
What about their internal operations?
Okay.
Something struck me as odd.
What's that?
The difference between their profitability and executive compensation.
Ah, I see what you mean.
Their PP margin has been low.
Even negative recently.
But some executives are getting big compensation packages.
Salaries,
Housing allowances, company cars.
the whole 9 yards.
Raises the question, is executive pay aligned with performance?
Is it justified?
It's something investors might want to look into,
Transparency is important.
especially for a company going public,
Investors want to see their money used well,
to grow the business.
not just for executive bonuses.
No, let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay. Their reliance on that electron beam accelerator.
Their secret weapon for cables.
But it could also be a weakness.
How so?
What if it breaks down?
It's a big, expensive piece of equipment.
What if a better technology comes along?
Makes their process obsolete.
Those are valid points.
Maintaining that equipment could cost a lot.
Upgrading it too.
And if they fall behind technologically...
They lose their advantage.
Exactly.
Highlights the importance of R&D.
They need to stay ahead of the curve.
Keep innovating.
You stay relevant.
So investors need to assess that technology.
Is it a long-term advantage?
Or a potential problem down the road.
Good question.
We've covered a lot.
Financials, growth, risks.
Everything.
What's the bottom line?
I think Quadrant Future Tek is at a crossroads.
They're solid in the cables market.
But their profitability isn't great.
It's like a reliable workhorse.
Not a flashy racehorse.
They're betting big on the train control and signaling division,
Huge growth potential.
but also big risks.
It's a gamble.
Investors are betting on which side of the company wins.
The steady workhorse or the ambitious racehorse.
Will they revolutionize India's railways?
Become a global player.
Or will they crumble under debt?
Reliance on government contracts.
The risks of their technology?
It's a classic story.
Ambition, innovation, risk.
That's what makes this IPO so interesting.
It is.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you the info you need.
To make an informed decision.
We've explored Quadrant Future Tek.
Their history, their model, their financials, their plans.
We've shown their strength.
And pointed out the risks.
Now it's up to you.
To connect the dots.
Weigh the potential rewards against the risks.
See if this IPO fits your goals.
Investing is always a gamble.
But doing your research,
Understanding the business
asking the right questions.
can make those gambles a little smarter.
Maybe this deep dive sparked an interest.
In specialty cables.
or automatic train protection.
There's always more to learn.
That's what the deep dive is all about.
Thanks for joining us
We'll see you next time.
for another deep dive.